We just saw how the container passes data to the nested component by binding to a nested component property that is decorated with the input decorator. If the nested component wants to send information back to its container, it can raise an event. The nested component exposes an event it can use to pass output to its container using the aptly named output decorator. We can use the output decorator to decorate any property of the nested components class. However, the property type must be an event. The only way a nested component can pass data back to its container is with an event. The data to pass becomes the event payload. In Angular, an event is defined with an event emitter object. So here we create a new instance of an event emitter. Notice the syntax here. TypeScript supports generics. If you are not familiar with generics, this syntax allows us to identify a specific type that the object instance will work with. When creating an event emitter, the generic argument identifies the type of the event payload. If we want to pass a string value to the container in the event payload, we define string here. If we want to pass an integer, we define number here. If we want to pass multiple values, we can specify an object here. In this example, we define a notify event with a string payload. When the user clicks on the stars, the star component receives that click event. We use event binding in the star component template to call the star component's onClick method. In the onClick method, we use the notify event property and call its emit method to raise the notify event to the container. If we want to pass data in the event payload, we pass that data into the emit method. In this example, the onClick method raises the notify event and sets the event payload to a string message. The container component receives that event with the specified payload. In the container components template, we use event binding to bind to this notify event and call a method. We access the event payload using $event. The only time we can specify a nested components property as an event binding target on the left side of an equals is when that property is decorated with the output decorator. Lastly, the container component provides the method to execute when the notify event occurs. Since the event payload is a string, this function takes in a string. Here we can perform any desired action. Lots of moving parts here. Let's jump into the code and try it out. We are back in the sample application looking at the star component. We'll add output and event emitter to our import statement because we know we're going to need them, and we'll reformat the line so we can readily see it. We want to expose an event to the container, so let's define a rating clicked event property. We define the type of this property to be event emitter, and we want the event payload to be a string, so we specify string as the generic argument. We set the rating click property to a new instance of event emitter. We decorate this property with the output decorator to expose it so that the container can respond to this event. The output decorator is a function, so we add parentheses. In this example, we are decorating only one property of the nested component with the output decorator, but we are not limited to one. We can expose multiple output properties as needed. Moving to the template, we use event binding to bind the div elements click event to a local onClick method. Then let's implement this onClick method in the component. When the star component processes the click event on the div, it wants to raise an event to the container and pass along a message. We use the event property and call its emit method, passing in the desired string. In this example, we use the ES2015 backticks to define a template string. This allows us to embed the rating directly into this string using $syntax. Our star component is then complete. Now let's respond to this event in our container. The product list component wants to listen for this rating clicked event, so let's update the product list template. Here, in the Nested Components directive, we'll add event binding to respond to the RatingClick event exposed by the star component, and we'll get the event payload. We respond by calling our own local method. We'll call it onRatingClicked. The event payload is available using $event, so we pass that in to the onRatingClicked method. We then need to write code for this new method in the Containers class. In the Product List component, we define the onRatingClicked method. We'll add it on the bottom with our other methods. We define a message string parameter for the event payload. To keep things simple, we'll just modify the page title to display Product List and the message from the nested component. Okay, yeah, that is not a very real-world example, but I wanted to keep this as straightforward as possible. We'd have a better example if the nested component contained an input box, and we could pass the user's input in the event payload. But you get the general idea here. Let's see how this works in the browser. We'll clear the filter by, click on the star rating, and we see the page title change to display the message received from the nested component. Success! We just saw how the container passes data to the nested component by binding to a nested component property that is decorated with the input decorator, and how the nested component uses an event property decorated with the output decorator to raise events. We can think of the properties decorated with the input or output decorators as the public API of the nestable component. Everything else in the component is encapsulated and only accessible to the component's template and class. Let's finish up this module with some checklists we can use as we build nestable components.